Rain hammered against the windshield of Detective James Thompson's unmarked Crown Victoria as he navigated through Detroit's dimly lit streets. His son Marcus sat in the backseat, homework spread across his lap, occasionally illuminated by passing streetlights. It wasn't protocol to have his kid with him this late, but Sarah was working a double shift at the hospital, and James hadn't wanted to leave his 10-year-old alone. Almost done with that math, buddy. James glanced in the rearview mirror, catching his son's concentrated expression. Marcus had his mother's focused determination, the kind that made straight A's look easy. Last problem, Dad, Marcus replied, pencil scratching against paper. Why'd you have to go back to the station so late? James tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The manila envelope tucked inside his jacket felt heavy, its contents even heavier. 3 months of undercover work had led to this moment. Evidence of Detective Sergeant Walsh, Lieutenant Parker, and Captain Rodriguez running a drug trafficking operation right under Internal Affairs' nose. The thought of his colleagues, men he'd shared meals with, betraying their badges made his stomach turn. The dashboard clock read 11:23 p.m. He just needed to get this evidence to Captain Chen, the one person in the department he still trusted completely. Chen had helped him navigate being one of the few black officers in the anti-corruption unit, had stood by him when others questioned his loyalty during difficult investigations. A pair of headlights appeared in his rear-view mirror, approaching fast. James checked his speedometer. He was already doing 5 over the limit. The headlights grew larger, accompanied by the distinctive crown of a police light bar. Everything okay, Dad? Marcus looked up from his homework, sensing the tension in his father's posture. Just a routine stop, son. Nothing to worry about. But James felt his pulse quicken as he pulled over. Something wasn't right. He hadn't radioed in his position, and this wasn't a normal patrol route. The police cruiser stopped behind them, and another appeared from a side street, boxing them in. James reached back, squeezing Marcus's knee. Whatever happens, stay down and stay quiet. Remember what I taught you about using the camcorder. Marcus nodded, already reaching for his father's old Sony Handycam in his backpack. James had taught him how to use it last summer, letting him film their family barbecues and baseball games. Now, his father's voice carried a weight that made Marcus's hands tremble as he powered it on. 3 figures approached the car, flashlights beam cutting through the rain. James recognized their gaits before he saw their faces. Walsh, Parker, Rodriguez. His heart sank. They must have had someone monitoring his communications. Step out of the vehicle, Detective Thompson. Walsh's voice carried none of the warmth it had held at last month's police fundraiser. James raised his hands slowly, making sure they could see them. Let's talk about this, Pete. What I found. I said step out of the vehicle. The order was punctuated by the distinctive sound of a service weapon being drawn. Marcus, James spoke calmly, though his heart was racing. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, don't make a sound. I love you, son. Remember that. The rain muffled Marcus's quiet sob as he pressed himself down into the footwell, the camcorder's night vision casting everything in an eerie green glow. Through the lens, he watched his father slowly exit the car, hands still raised. You really thought you could take us down, James? Rodriguez stepped forward, his badge catching the streetlight. You should have just played along, taken your cut like everyone else. We swore an oath. James's voice was steady, dignified even in the face of death. What you're doing. It destroys the very community we promised to protect. Always the Boy Scout, Parker spat. Always thinking you're better than us. The rain continued its relentless descent, washing away footprints and evidence. But it couldn't wash away the truth being captured by a terrified 10-year-old boy, whose world was about to shatter in the next 60 seconds. Through the camcorder's viewfinder, Marcus watched the world dissolve into a nightmare. The green night vision display made everything look alien, surreal, as if he were watching a horror movie instead of reality. His father stood in the rain, hands still raised, water streaming down his face. The three officers, men who had once ruffled Marcus's hair at department picnics, formed a triangle around him. "Where's the evidence, James?" Walsh's voice barely carried over the rain. "We know you made copies." "It's already been distributed," James lied smoothly, the manila envelope still pressed against his chest beneath his jacket. "You can't bury this anymore." Marcus's finger trembled on the record button, remembering his father's words from their countless safety talks. James had always been preparing him, in subtle ways, for the dangers that came with being a good cop in a corrupt system. "Sometimes the camera is your only witness, son," he'd said while teaching Marcus how to use the Handycam. "And witnesses keep people honest." Rodriguez stepped closer, his gold captain's bars visible in the streetlight. "Your boy's in the car, isn't he, James? The one you're always bragging about." A cruel smile played across his face. "Would hate for anything to happen to him." Marcus saw his father's shoulders tense, the first crack in his composed facade. "This is between us. He's innocent." Like those kids in the projects were innocent. James's voice rose with controlled anger. "The ones getting hooked on your poison. The families being terrorized into silence." Parker laughed, a hollow sound that echoed off the wet pavement. "Look at you, still trying to be the hero. You know what happens to heroes in this city, James." The camcorder captured it all. Parker moving behind James, Walsh drawing closer with his weapon raised, Rodriguez reaching for something in his jacket. Marcus wanted to scream, to run out and save his father, but terror froze him in place. His father's last order, to stay quiet, to stay hidden, became the only thing keeping him from moving. "You have a choice, James," Rodriguez said. "Give us the evidence, take a promotion and a cut of the business, or—" He left the threat hanging in the air. James straightened his spine, dignity emanating from every inch of his frame. "I've already made my choice. 20 years ago, when I took the oath to protect and serve. My son is watching, learning what it means to be a man. I won't teach him that justice can be bought." Wrong answer. Walsh nodded to Parker. The next few seconds burned themselves into Marcus's memory and the camcorder's memory card simultaneously. The muffled sound of the first shot. His father's body jerking forward. 2 more shots in quick succession. James Thompson fell to his knees, then forward onto the wet asphalt, the manila envelope slipping from his jacket. Rodriguez picked up the envelope, shielding it from the rain with his jacket. "Call it in as a shootout with drug dealers. James was investigating a lead. Got ambushed. We responded too late to save him." "What about the kid?" Parker asked, holstering his weapon. "What kid?" "Car's empty." Walsh had already checked, his flashlight beam sweeping past Marcus's hiding spot without seeing him. Besides, who's going to believe a child over 3 decorated officers? They moved efficiently, like they'd done this before. Walsh radioed for backup while Rodriguez planted a throwaway gun near James's body. Parker began constructing their cover story out loud, rehearsing it like lines in a play. Marcus remained motionless, the camcorder capturing every detail. Badge numbers, faces, the casual way they discussed covering up his father's murder. His tears mixed with the rain, now streaming through the slightly opened window, but he didn't make a sound. The camera became his anchor to reality, its small red recording light a tiny beacon of truth in the darkness. 20 minutes later, when the first responding officers arrived, they found a crime scene already corrupted by rain and lies. But the truth was safely preserved in digital memory, held by trembling hands that would one day use it to tear down an empire of corruption. The precinct interview room felt smaller each time Sarah Thompson sat in it, her son's hand clutched tightly in hers. For the 3rd time in 2 weeks, they faced Detective Miller from Internal Affairs, a man who seemed more interested in poking holes in their story than finding James's killers. "Mrs. Thompson," Miller sighed, flipping through his notes with manufactured concern, "your son's story keeps changing. First, He said there were 3 officers, then 4, now he's back to 3 again. There were 3. Marcus spoke up, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. Badge numbers 8219, 7403, and 6891. I told you this already. Miller's pen stopped moving. Interesting that you remember those numbers so clearly, but you can't seem to recall what kind of car they drove. Sarah leaned forward, her nurse's uniform still on from her interrupted shift. My son watched his father die. He's traumatized, not lying. We have the video. The video that mysteriously disappeared from evidence. Miller's eyebrows raised. The one that no other officer on scene saw you turn in. Officer Chen saw it, Marcus insisted. He was there when Mom gave it to him. The room fell silent. Sarah closed her eyes, pain etching deeper lines around them. Captain Chen had been found dead in his apartment 3 days after James's murder, an apparent suicide. His service weapon in his hand, a typed note expressing guilt over failing to protect a fellow officer. Listen, Miller's voice softened with practiced sympathy. I know this is hard. But you're accusing 3 highly respected officers of murder. Captain Rodriguez has served this department for 25 years. Lieutenant Parker heads our community outreach program. And Detective Sergeant Walsh, he was your husband's partner for 5 years. Sarah's lawyer, Martin Brooks, finally spoke up. And what about the evidence James was carrying that night? The envelope? No envelope was found at the scene, Miller replied smoothly. Just a throwaway gun and traces of cocaine consistent with a drug deal gone bad. The toxicology report. That's a lie. Marcus shouted, jumping up. Dad never touched drugs. They planted that gun. I saw them do it. Marcus, Sarah pulled him back down, her voice breaking. Baby, please. The door opened, and Chief Harrison stepped in. A rare appearance for such an interview. His presence filled the small room with an authority that made Sarah's spine stiffen. Mrs. Thompson. Harrison spoke with grandfatherly concern. We've been patient because we understand your loss. But these accusations, they're damaging good officers' reputations. Officers who responded to help your husband. They killed him, Marcus whispered, tears finally breaking through his composure. Harrison continued as if he hadn't heard. We have 16 witnesses from the housing project who saw your husband in an altercation with known drug dealers. The evidence is clear. Witnesses who changed their stories overnight. Brooks interjected. My office has proof of intimidation. Careful, counselor. Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. That sounds like an accusation of police misconduct. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Brooks closed his notepad slowly, 20 years of fighting losing battles against the system evident in his tired eyes. Mrs. Thompson. Harrison turned back to Sarah. The department is prepared to be generous. Full pension, medical benefits, college fund for the boy. All we need is your signature stating you accept the official findings and drop any further investigation. Sarah looked at her son, seeing James's determination in his eyes. Then she looked at the photo on Miller's desk. Marcus's school picture next to a newspaper clipping about recent gang-related violence in their neighborhood. The threat couldn't have been clearer. We'll need time to consider it, she whispered. That night, Sarah packed their essential belongings into 2 suitcases. By morning, their house would be empty, their lives in Detroit reduced to memories and nightmares. Chicago would become their refuge, but the truth, captured on a memory card hidden in Marcus's favorite teddy bear, would travel with them, waiting for the day justice could finally prevail. The basement firing range at Quantico echoed with precise shots as Marcus Thompson, now 30, emptied his clip into the target. Each bullet found its mark with surgical precision, forming a tight cluster where the heart would be. His FBI firearms instructor, Agent Cooper, watched with a mixture of admiration and concern. You know, Thompson, most trainees eventually blink during rapid-fire drills, Cooper commented, examining the target sheet. 20 years on the range, and I've never seen anyone maintain such perfect form without flinching. Marcus ejected the empty magazine, his movements mechanical, practiced. I learned early that blinking can cost you everything. In his mind, each shot carried the weight of memory. Badge 8219, Bullet 1. Badge 7403, Bullet 2. Badge 6891, Bullet 3. The ritual had become his meditation, his purpose distilled into powder and lead. Later that evening, in his Spartan apartment just off the academy grounds, Marcus updated his files. 3 monitors displayed different aspects of his targets' lives. Rodriguez had become Detroit's police chief 2 years ago, his tough-on-crime stance earning him political favor. Parker now headed internal affairs, burying complaints against officers with the same efficiency he helped cover up James Thompson's murder. Walsh, the most ambitious of the 3, was positioning himself for a mayoral run, his campaign built on promises of police reform. The irony would have been amusing if it wasn't so sickening. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from his mother. Proud of you, baby. Your father would be too. Sarah had rebuilt their lives in Chicago, never returning to Detroit, never speaking of that night. But she knew. Mothers always know. His laptop showed a different kind of target practice. Financial records, surveillance photos, network analyses of corruption patterns in the Detroit PD. The FBI had recruited him straight out of law school, impressed by his academic record and his thesis on institutional corruption in law enforcement. They didn't know that every class, every training session, every assignment was another piece in a puzzle 2 decades in the making. Agent Thompson. A knock at his door interrupted his research. Assistant Director Lancaster entered without waiting for a response. Burning the midnight oil again. Marcus smoothly switched his screens to case files he was officially working on. Just reviewing the Cincinnati corruption case, sir. There are patterns here that might be useful for other investigations. Lancaster nodded, studying the younger agent. Your analytical skills are exceptional. The kind we need in our police corruption task force. He placed a folder on Marcus's desk. How do you feel about temporary reassignment to Detroit? Years of practice kept Marcus's expression neutral, but his heart rate spiked. Detroit, sir. Their new police chief, Rodriguez, has requested federal assistance in implementing department-wide reforms. Political window dressing, probably, but it gives us access. Lancaster tapped the folder. You be our point man, working directly with their internal affairs division. Under Lieutenant Parker, Marcus stated, allowing himself a small smile. I've studied his department's structure. Of course you have. Lancaster chuckled. You've studied everything. That's why you're perfect for this. We need someone who can spot the rot beneath the shine. He headed for the door, then paused. The assignment starts in 2 weeks. I need your answer by Friday. After Lancaster left, Marcus opened his father's old badge case. Behind the shield, he kept a single frame printed from the camcorder footage, 3 faces in the rain, unaware they were being recorded. He'd studied those faces every day for 20 years, watching them age through surveillance photos and news clippings, learning their habits, their weaknesses, their sins. His phone buzzed again. A news alert. Detroit mayoral candidate Walsh promises new era of police accountability. Marcus opened his laptop and began composing his acceptance email to Lancaster. His words were professional, eager, but measured. Perfect for a young agent ambitious to prove himself. Nothing that would suggest the weight of 2 decades of patience, planning, and purpose. The hunter was ready, and his prey had no idea they were already in his crosshairs. Detroit's skyline had changed in 20 years, but the streets still held their memories. Marcus sat in his bureau-issued SUV outside the police headquarters, watching officers come and go through tinted windows. The building's limestone facade hadn't changed. Same steps where his father used to wait for him after school, Same flagpole where they'd taken his last department photo. Agent Thompson. Officer Ramirez tapped on his window. Chief Rodriguez is ready for your meeting. Marcus grabbed his briefcase, each step up those familiar stairs measured and deliberate. Officers nodded respectfully at his FBI credentials, unaware that he once played in these same halls. The 11th floor executive suite was new. Rodriguez had renovated it after his promotion, all glass and polished steel. Agent Thompson. Rodriguez rose from behind his massive desk, hand extended. His hair had grayed, face heavier, but the smile was the same one that had promised death 2 decades ago. Welcome to Detroit. Marcus shook the offered hand, his grip professional, nothing in his expression betraying the surge of rage beneath his skin. Chief Rodriguez, thank you for having me. Please, call me Robert. We're all on the same team here. Rodriguez gestured to the leather chairs facing his desk. I have to admit, when I requested federal assistance, I didn't expect them to send someone so young. I specialize in departmental reform and anti-corruption measures, Marcus replied smoothly. My age tends to make officers less defensive. They see me as less threatening. Rodriguez laughed, the sound grating against Marcus's ears. Smart. Very smart. You'll be working closely with our IA division. Lieutenant Parker should be joining us. The door opened, and Parker walked in, 20 years heavier but carrying the same air of casual authority. Sorry I'm late, Chief. Traffic was? He paused, studying Marcus with a slight frown. Something wrong, Jack? Rodriguez asked. Parker shook his head. No, just, you remind me of someone, Agent Thompson. Can't place it. I have that kind of face, Marcus smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. Common features. The meeting proceeded with discussions of access protocols, reporting structures, and integration plans. Marcus watched them perform their roles. Rodriguez the reformer, Parker the dutiful watchdog, knowing their real conversations would happen later, behind closed doors, planning how to control this federal intrusion. One last thing, Marcus said as the meeting concluded. I'd like to review some cold cases, get a sense of the department's investigative evolution, particularly those from around 2003. A microscopic tension crossed Rodriguez's face. Any particular reason for that year? Statistical anomaly. There was a spike in officer-involved shootings that year, followed by a sharp decline. It's an interesting pattern from an analytical perspective. Ancient history. Parker waved dismissively. Records from that far back are spotty at best. I'm very good at piecing together fragments, Marcus replied, gathering his papers. You'd be amazed what surfaces after 20 years. Walking out of headquarters, Marcus spotted Walsh across the street, surrounded by campaign staffers and reporters. The soon-to-be mayoral candidate was announcing his new police oversight initiative, promising transparency and accountability. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and Marcus saw the flicker of unease cross Walsh's face, the instinctive recognition of a predator sensing something hunting him. Back in his temporary apartment that evening, Marcus accessed the encrypted files he'd been building for years. Photos, financial records, surveillance reports, and witness statements formed a digital noose around the trio's necks. But timing would be everything. Rush it, and they'd slip away. Wait too long, and Walsh's political ascension would make him virtually untouchable. His phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. Saw you today. You look just like him. Same walk, same eyes. Chen Jr. Marcus smiled. Captain Chen's son had followed his father's footsteps, joining the force 5 years ago. Another piece moving into position, another allied who remembered the truth about 2003. The hunt was officially beginning, and his prey had just felt the first whisper of the wind shifting against them. Lieutenant Parker stared at the envelope on his desk, his coffee growing cold beside it. Inside was a single photograph. Himself, Rodriguez, and Walsh standing in the rain 20 years ago. The image was grainy, green-tinted from night vision, but unmistakable. The note attached read simply, "Badge numbers 8219, 7403, 6891. Memory is a funny thing." His phone buzzed. Rodriguez demanding an emergency meeting. Within an hour, all three men gathered in Walsh's campaign office after hours, the photograph lying between them like a live grenade. "It's impossible," Walsh paced, his polished campaign persona cracking. "We checked the car. There was no camera, no witnesses." "The boy," Rodriguez said quietly. "James's kid was in the backseat." "That was 20 years ago," Parker snapped. "If he had evidence, why wait until now?" "Because now I'm running for mayor." Walsh stopped pacing. "Now Rodriguez is up for the state police commissioner appointment. Now we're vulnerable." A knock interrupted them. Walsh's campaign manager with the evening news summary. "Sir, you need to see this. Someone leaked documents about police property seizures from 2003 to 2005. The Detroit Free Press is running it tomorrow." After she left, Rodriguez's face had turned ashen. "Those seizures, that was our starting capital. The foundation of everything." "I'll handle the press," Walsh said. "We've weathered worse." But they hadn't weathered worse. Over the next 2 weeks, their carefully constructed world began to unravel thread by thread. Anonymous tips led to internal affairs investigations of their closest allies. Old cases were mysteriously reopened. Witnesses they'd paid off decades ago suddenly developed consciences. Marcus watched it all unfold from his temporary office in internal affairs. He observed Parker's increasing paranoia, noted Rodriguez's desperate attempts to maintain control, and monitored Walsh's plummeting poll numbers. Each man had received similar photographs, each one a perfectly timed reminder of their past sins. Agent Thompson, Chen Jr., David, stood in his doorway. "Those case files you requested from archives. Found them in an odd place." Marcus accepted the box, waiting until they were alone. Inside, beneath stacks of official reports, laid his father's original case notes on the drug trafficking operation. Chen Sr. had hidden them well, a final act of defiance before his suicide. "My father wasn't the only good cop they destroyed," David said quietly. "Just the most visible." "No," Marcus agreed, "but he might be the one that destroys them." The next move came at Walsh's biggest campaign fundraiser. As he took the stage to speak about police reform, every screen in the ballroom began playing a slideshow. Property records showing mysterious wealth, bank transfers to offshore accounts, surveillance photos of meetings with known criminals. No direct evidence of murder, not yet, but enough to make their whole house of cards tremble. "Who's doing this?" Walsh demanded later that night, bursting into Rodriguez's office. "Who's digging this deep?" Rodriguez motioned to the young FBI agent's office across the hall. "Thompson. It has to be. He's been reviewing cold cases, asking questions about 2003. "So shut him down," Walsh hissed. "Use your connections at the Bureau." "It's not that simple," Parker interjected, looking older by the day. "I had him checked out. His record's perfect. Too perfect. Like he's been planning this his whole life." The realization hit them simultaneously. Rodriguez pulled up an old department photo on his computer, James Thompson in uniform, smiling, proud. They compared it to their surveillance photo of Agent Thompson entering the building that morning. "Jesus Christ," Walsh whispered. "It's the kid. We've given the son of the man we murdered complete access to our department." Marcus chose that moment to walk past Rodriguez's office, nodding politely through the glass. In his hand was another envelope, identical to the ones they'd each received. Their eyes followed him, finally seeing what they should have recognized immediately: James Thompson's walk, his bearing, his unflinching sense of purpose. The hunters had become the hunted, and their own guilty consciences were becoming their worst enemies. The Detroit Police Department's annual Reform and Transparency Conference filled the convention center with a sea of blue uniforms and press badges. Marcus stood backstage, watching Walsh prepare for his keynote address. The mayoral candidate was sweating slightly under the bright lights, his perfectly crafted image showing cracks around the edges. 2 minutes, Mr. Walsh, a stagehand called out. Marcus checked his phone. One new message from David Chen. Everyone's in position. Dad would be proud. Across the hall, FBI teams quietly took their places, blending with the crowd. 20 years of evidence, all leading to this moment. Walsh took the podium to polite applause. 20 years ago, I made a promise to this city. The first image appeared on the giant screen behind him. The rainy night, 3 officers standing over James Thompson's body. The audience fell silent. Walsh froze mid-sentence. Please continue, Mr. Walsh, Marcus called out, stepping onto the stage. You were talking about promises. Rodriguez and Parker rose from their seats in the front row, but federal agents quickly blocked their exits. The convention center doors clicked shut. That can't be real. Walsh stammered into the microphone. Marcus pulled out his father's old badge. Badge number 4573. Detective James Thompson. You remember him, don't you? You all shared Christmas dinner the week before you murdered him. The crowd erupted in whispers. Phones came out, cameras flashing. Rodriguez made a move toward a side door, but stopped when Marcus raised his hand. Before anyone tries to leave, Marcus's voice carried through the hall. Know that every exit is covered by federal agents. And this, he gestured to the screen, is just the beginning. The video began to play. The full, restored footage from that night. Crystal clear, with enhanced audio. Every word, every action, every casual discussion of how to cover up a murder played out before hundreds of witnesses. That's been doctored, Parker shouted, desperation in his voice. This is a vendetta by a grieving son. Interesting theory, Marcus replied calmly. He nodded to David Chen, who clicked to the next slide. These are bank records showing payments to witnesses who changed their testimony. Wire transfers through shell companies. Captain Chen discovered them before you had him killed. Rodriguez lunged for the stage. You little. 2 FBI agents caught him mid-stride. Chief Rodriguez, Marcus continued, or should I say, Inmate Rodriguez, the FBI has been building this case for years. Your drug operation didn't end in 2003. It just got bigger, didn't it? More sophisticated. More political. Walsh grabbed Marcus's arm. Listen to me, son. We can talk about this. Whatever you want. Money, position, power. Name it. Marcus looked down at the hand on his arm, then into Walsh's eyes. You offered my father the same choice, didn't you? Right before you murdered him in front of his 10-year-old son. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Marcus produced an evidence bag containing a manila envelope, weathered, water-stained, but intact. My father's original evidence, found exactly where Captain Chen hid it before his suicide. 20 years of additional corruption documented inside. Every deal, every payoff, every murder. This is a circus, Parker shouted. A publicity stunt by a disturbed individual. Agent Thompson has full federal authority. Assistant Director Lancaster's voice boomed from the back of the hall. And the complete support of the Bureau. Gentlemen, you're under arrest. As federal agents moved in, Marcus addressed the shocked audience. My father died because he believed in justice. Because he refused to look the other way. These men didn't just kill him. They corrupted this department, this city, for 2 decades. Today that ends. The arrests were chaos. Rodriguez fought, had to be restrained. Parker broke down, began naming names. Walsh maintained his politician's smile even as the handcuffs clicked shut. Years of practice at hiding his true nature holding firm until the end. Marcus watched them being led away, his father's badge heavy in his hand. A reporter shoved a microphone in his face. Agent Thompson, was this personal or professional? Justice, Marcus replied, is always both. The Detroit Police Department's evidence room buzzed with activity at 3 a.m., 2 days after the arrests. Marcus stood among boxes of seized documents, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. Each new file confirmed what he always suspected. His father's murder was just the tip of an iceberg of corruption. Agent Thompson, David Chen called out, holding up a ledger. Found another connection. Judge Matthews. He signed off on every suspicious warrant from 2003 to 2015. Add it to the board, Marcus replied, studying the complex web of relationships and crimes they'd mapped across an entire wall. Red strings connected photos, documents, and names. A 20-year cancer finally exposed to light. His phone buzzed. Assistant Director Lancaster. Turn on Channel 7. The break room television showed Parker in an orange jumpsuit, flanked by lawyers. The ticker beneath read, Boré King. Former Internal Affairs Chief makes full confession. Names dozens in corruption scandal. I can't live with it anymore, Parker was saying, his previous arrogance replaced by desperate confession. The Thompson murder was just the beginning. We used the drug money to build a network. Judges, politicians, business leaders, everyone got a cut. If they refused, he swallowed hard. There were others like Thompson. Good cops who asked too many questions. Marcus's phone lit up again. This time, a text from his mother. Are you watching? Your father would be proud, baby, but please be careful. The warning wasn't unnecessary. Within hours of Parker's confession, 2 witnesses had already turned up dead. Another judge was found in his car, an apparent suicide. The corrupt system was eating itself, desperate to contain the damage. Agent Thompson. A young officer burst into the evidence room. Rodriguez wants to talk. Says he'll only speak to you. The holding cell area was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Rodriguez sat in an interview room, hands cuffed to the table, his chief's uniform replaced by prison orange. Hello, Robert. Marcus sat across from him, ready to confess too. You think this ends with us? Rodriguez leaned forward. We were just middle management. The real power. They'll never let this get to trial. That's why we're moving you to federal custody tonight, Marcus replied. Along with copies of every document, every recording, every piece of evidence. If anything happens to any of you, it all goes public. The whole machine crashes. Rodriguez's face fell. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I had 20 years. Your father, Rodriguez said quietly, he was a good man. We tried to reason with him. Don't. Marcus's voice cut like steel. You don't get to talk about him. Back in the evidence room, the revelations kept coming. Officers came forward with stories of coercion and threats. Community members spoke about years of intimidation. A computer seized from Walsh's campaign office revealed offshore accounts, blackmail files, and a list of problems that had been solved. David Chen approached with another box. Found these in a storage unit registered to my father. Looks like he was building his own case, right up until they killed him too, Marcus finished. Your father was a hero, David, like mine. Agent Thompson. Lancaster strode in, face grave. Walsh's lawyers are offering a deal. Full cooperation for reduced sentences. Marcus shook his head. No deals. Not for my father's murderers. It's bigger than that now, Lancaster argued. With Walsh's testimony, we can reach all the way to City Hall, maybe the state capitol. This could clean up decades of corruption. The weight of the choice pressed down on Marcus. Personal vengeance versus systemic justice. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes being a good cop means making hard choices. Okay, Marcus finally said, but I want to be the one to interview him. And first, he confesses to my father's murder. All of them do. On record. No ambiguity. No excuses. As dawn broke over Detroit, more officers arrived at headquarters, not to work, but to turn themselves in. The wall of silence that had protected corruption for decades was crumbling, one confession at a time. The truth, so long buried, was finally rising to the surface, and nothing could stop its emergence. The federal courthouse stood silent in the early morning light, its marble steps still wet from overnight rain. Marcus adjusted his tie, watching the media crews set up their equipment. In 1 hour, the verdicts would be read, the culmination of a 3-month trial that had shaken Detroit to its foundations. His phone buzzed. A message from his mother. "I'm here, baby. 3rd row, like always." Sarah Thompson had attended every day of the trial, her quiet strength a reminder of why this all mattered. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Rodriguez, Parker, and Walsh sat at the defense table, their expensive suits unable to mask their defeat. The evidence had been overwhelming. 20 years of corruption documented in excruciating detail, dozens of witnesses, and finally, their own confessions about that rainy night in 2003. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Judge Martinez entered, her face solemn. The jury followed, none making eye contact with the defendants. Marcus felt his father's badge in his pocket, its weight both comfort and burden. In the matter of the United States versus Rodriguez, Parker, and Walsh, the judge began, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." The verdicts came like hammer blows. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Murder, corruption, conspiracy, drug trafficking. The list went on. When it was done, all 3 men faced life sentences without possibility of parole. Before sentencing, Judge Martinez addressed the courtroom. Would any of the defendants like to make a statement? Walsh stood first, his politician's mask finally cracking. "I've had 20 years to think about that night. About James Thompson. He was right about everything. What we were doing to the community, to the badge. We became the very thing we swore to fight against." Rodriguez and Parker made similar confessions, but Marcus barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on a point just beyond the judge's bench, remembering a 10-year-old boy hiding in a car, watching his world end through a camera lens. After the sentencing, Marcus slipped away from the media frenzy. He drove through familiar streets to Detroit Memorial Cemetery, where his father's gravestone stood under an old oak tree. Sarah was already there, placing fresh flowers. "He would be so proud of you," she said, hugging him tight. Not just for bringing them down, but for doing it the right way. Marcus knelt by the grave, placing his FBI badge beside the headstone. "I kept my promise, Dad. The truth came out." Agent Thompson. David Chen approached quietly, holding a small box. "Found this in my father's old files. Thought you should have it." Inside was James Thompson's original detective shield, still bearing faint bloodstains from that night. With it was a note from Chen Sr. "If you're reading this, the truth finally won. James died protecting it. Never let them forget that." Later that evening, Marcus sat in his father's favorite diner, nursing a coffee. The news played silently on the TV above the counter. Footage of more arrests, more officials being led away in handcuffs. The corruption had reached higher than anyone imagined, and the cleanup was far from over. His phone lit up with a text from Lancaster. "Mayor's office wants you to head the new police oversight committee. Interested?" Before Marcus could reply, an elderly man approached his booth. "You're Thompson's boy, aren't you? I was a beat cop when your father was coming up. He taught me something I never forgot. Said the badge isn't about power, it's about responsibility. About standing up even when you're standing alone." Marcus smiled, remembering his father saying those exact words. He was right. "You did good, son," the old officer continued. "You did real good." As night fell over Detroit, Marcus drove past police headquarters one last time. The building looked different now, cleaned of its worst corruption but scarred by the process. Like the city itself, it would need time to heal, to rebuild trust. His father's badge and his FBI shield sat on the passenger seat, 2 generations of law enforcement united in purpose. Justice had been delayed, but not denied. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the city, other corrupt officers were looking over their shoulders, wondering if they too would face judgment for their sins. The price of justice had been high, but tomorrow would bring a new day, a better department, and perhaps, finally, peace for a 10-year-old boy who had witnessed too much, too soon.